Before I begin, I'd like to clear up some things in this inaugural installment so you don't get the wrong impression. First and foremost, Let's Dissect is not a series of videos about biological dissections. If you're looking to slice up Kermit, you've come to the wrong place. If you've gathered that this series is about video games, then I should note that it's not going to be a typical review show per se. It's generally going to be me talking about very specific things that I found interesting and memorable in the many games I've played over the years. Unlike many other online videos about video games, the emphasis is really going to be more on analysis than humor. And I think you'll come to find that the humor I do employ is quite subdued. Now, let's begin. The Naughty Dog era of the Crash Bandicoot series holds a special place in my heart. Not only because they were a popular set of games that I grew up on, but also because I think I recognized even back then that they had design elements that I really enjoy. Now, my personal favorite of this era has to be Crash Bandicoot 2, but even then I can't deny that the first one is a close second favorite and probably holds an even more special place in my heart despite its sometimes brutal difficulty and weird save mechanism. It is often the case that first installments have some weirdness to them before a series hits its stride in a later sequel. But the first Crash Bandicoot game had some weirdness that was greatly changed or completely eradicated in all further installments. For instance, Crash's sexualized girlfriend Tana and Bree's speaking role are odd ducklings in the context of the entire era. Actually, since later games pretty much forget about those two minor points, let's do the same. Let's shift the focus to the game design. While I've not always agreed on what I thought was best for the series, I've rarely thought Naughty Dog did a bad job designing and implementing core mechanics and level progression. I may have occasionally disagreed with him, but I've always respected them. A great example of that can be found in the first level of this game. Not unlike a certain other game that you may be familiar with, the first level does a pretty good job of guiding you towards learning almost everything you need to know in order to succeed throughout the game, and it manages to do so without an explicit tutorial or immersion-breaking button prompts. You may not find this aspect of the game praiseworthy since they could fairly easily get away with it due to the simplicity of avatar control in this first installment, but the first level of Crash 2 and 3 also only required fairly simple actions to complete, yet I feel Naughty Dog didn't do nearly as good a job there as they did in the first level of the first Crash game. Again, whether or not you think it's memorable or interesting when compared to your reference pools is not the point. I'm mentioning it because I do find it both memorable and interesting. I think it's reasonable to say that even a first-time player of Crash Bandicoot, or of a 3D platforming game in general, would be smart enough to at least figure out that the directional pad on the controller corresponds to moving the in-game avatar. Jumping and spinning are the only other actions required in this game, and I want to take a moment to examine how the first level encourages you to teach yourself how to perform these actions. For the sake of this examination, let's assume the player is completely unwilling to learn new things unless the learning happens incidentally or is required to progress. Consequently, it's going to be a pretty extreme and improbable example, but if Naughty Dog can account for teaching this hypothetical dunce, then by extension I think such should also cover all players that are more reasonable. So, if our dunce resolves to only move his avatar, he'll quickly encounter a crab, and if he runs directly into it, he'll have to start over. Even so, at this point he still doesn't need to learn anything new. That only happens when he runs into a pit that cannot be surmounted with movement alone. If he's not familiar with the genre, he may not understand what the decreasing numbers in the top right mean whenever he runs into a pit or runs into a crab. However, if he continues along his stubborn path, he'll eventually get a game over, and he should realize that he is not progressing. Now let's say he experimented just long enough to learn the jump command. With this, he can proceed past the first crab and the first pit. If he then goes into the second pit, he hopefully recognizes the pattern that pits hinder progression. When he gets to the far wall, he's required to jump up it. Now, there's a fairly good chance that a player who's inexperienced will accidentally bounce and break one of the boxes along the way. However, let's assume that he has heliphobia or something, and that, through luck or skill, he manages to avoid breaking any boxes. At this point, he could reasonably progress to the too-high crate wall roughly halfway through the level. He should realize that he can't simply walk through this wall. At this point, most players have probably learned how to spin crates to break them by now. However, if our dunce has an uncharacteristic moment of brilliance, he might realize that he can exploit the level geometry to jump past the wall of crates and continue to the end of the level without using the spin move even once. Thus, we see that the first level has, in the worst case scenario, only succeeded in teaching the player how to move and jump. Spinning, which is a pretty important move to learn, is not technically required for success, though it's somewhat unreasonable to expect players to figure out a jumping workaround for the crate wall before they figure out how to spin. Despite this minor criticism of the setup of the first level, the player absolutely is required to use spins in another early level of the game. So I think Naughty Dog covered their bases pretty well. Additionally, one of Crash's first actions is to spin without player input, which I think suggests that that action is both possible and possibly important. Now let's go back and assume our dunce has either already learned or just plain starts out more reasonable. Let's assume that he tried all the buttons and learned how to jump and spin when interacting with the crates at the start. He's likely to learn a bevy of other things about the game world in this first level now. Let me list a few. He can learn that spun enemies fly off into the distance and can injure other enemies and or break boxes. He can learn that boxes may not always be conspicuous. The first Aku Aku crate is not too hidden, but it does require at least a little effort to find it. He can learn that having Aku Aku masks permit the survival of certain injuries. Additionally, he can learn that storing enough masks allows him to enter a superpowered state where enemies and crates are effortlessly taken care of. He can learn that checkpoint boxes can prevent him from starting at the beginning of the level. He can learn that levels may have branching paths, and that one may be required to explore all paths to get 100% completion. He can learn about exclamation point boxes and what they do by a clear setup on the right path. Additionally, he can learn that finding and activating these boxes can be necessary for 100% completion. He can learn that the game tells him how many boxes he did not break, as well as that breaking all boxes rewards him with a gem. He doesn't know why he might want a gem now, but at least he can save his game or get a password. Quite a lot crammed in there for such a short level, don't you think? And while the hypothetical player might not learn about all the game's tricks just yet, he's already learned a lot and will continue to learn more in the next couple of levels. Now, let's examine what can be learned in the second level. Right away, you're introduced to a new type of crate, the TNT crate. If you spin it, it will explode and injure or kill you. You might think that this violent reaction is a bit unfair since you didn't know ahead of time that it was deadly, but at least this happened right at the beginning of the level and you didn't lose much progress. If you jump on the crate instead, a timer starts counting down. If you stick around, you'll be caught in the blast and injured or killed. If you move away, the crate will detonate and you won't take any damage. Thus, with a few seconds of experimentation, you can learn almost everything you need to know about TNT crates, and you learn all that immediately in the second level. Anyway, eventually you'll come across a jungle roller. This is the first time that a part of the environment moves, and you can learn that colliding with moving environmental objects, just like colliding with enemies, is dangerous unless you're under the effects of invincibility. Just after that, there's a crate housing a bonus token. I've always felt that the Tawna bonus tokens were weird since the coloration of Tawna's hair makes it look like there's a background to a weird and pointy-headed creature. But that's neither here nor there. Let's move on. There's a strange but notable thing roughly midway through the level, but I'll get to that later. Let's continue with the bonus token stuff for now. After getting the second and third tokens, you'll be transported to a special treetop area. As the screen clearly says, getting to the end allows you to use a save point. As I mentioned before, you can also save or get a password when you acquire a gem, but strangely your level progress cannot be saved when merely running through the levels for fun. You must complete a bonus round or acquire some collectible before you can do that. It's a little irritating, but there are some more problematic things I should probably talk about instead. While I wholeheartedly enjoy the game, I recognize that it still has flaws. Besides the aforementioned sometimes overbearing difficulty and weird save mechanism, I think some of its biggest flaws, at least in terms of conveying information, involve the gems. The player is most likely to encounter a clear or white gem as their first, yet there is no hint to their purpose until very close to the end of the game. I suppose the developers assume that the pride of 100% completion and the associations of gems and wealth would be enough to motivate players to acquire them. While that may be sufficient, I personally think they should have hinted at the purpose of these gems earlier. Perhaps Naughty Dog realized this later, as Crash 2 explains the point of collecting gems and the newly introduced crystals quite early in the game. The clear/white gems are a comparatively minor issue though in Crash 1, as I think issues with the colored gems are much more severe because of how they can frustrate the player. Compared to the first level, getting all the boxes in the second level is fairly straightforward, and when you do so, the game will cheerily inform you that you missed 3 boxes. Now, no matter how hard you try, you won't be able to find those last 3 boxes right now. It turns out that you need a green gem from a later level, but your only hint is this pathetic and tiny ghost gem near the place where having the specified colored gem is relevant. The ghost gem itself is noticeable because it increases and decreases in size, but I think it's unreasonable for players to make the connection between these and the regular gems this early on. The third level is a bit better about this though, as the arc of ghost gems more clearly hints that you could do something else if only they were solid. Even so, I think this is frustrating and poorly explained, as you'll never get a color gem before you see its ghost gem counterpart, and because the first island in particular is plagued with requiring color gems for 100% level completion. There are kinder ways to suggest that backtracking is necessary, though again this is something that was fortunately improved upon in Crash 2. Now, I could go on to talk about what else is learned in later levels, but I think at this point I've covered the most important tutorial parts of the game. Let's instead move on to some other things I want to talk about. If this first Crash game does anything consistently better than all the others, it's atmosphere. Crash 1 uses its aesthetics and music to amazing effect. One of the most notable instances of that for me is in Native Fortress, the last level of the first island. When you get towards the top of the structure and begin to see the skyline, you'll notice this huge tree as well as what appears to be some demented castle in the background. This castle is actually the main villain Cortex's castle, which you can see on the map screen and in the introductory cutscene. It's a fairly simple detail considering it's just a pixelated and static sprite acting as a backdrop, but it has always struck me as something special. Since many of the levels are linear, at times the game can feel almost claustrophobic, but the expanse of the sky, plus that castle way in the distance, make the game feel so much more open and epic than the budget and hardware limitations permitted. You get the sense that this is nothing but a small and early step on a long journey to that castle far, far away, and that wonderful sense of scale is a feeling that few games evoke for me. Among those familiar with this Crash game, there's a debate as to which level in the final product is the most difficult and/or worst. The main candidates usually are Sunset Vista and Slippery Climb, but of course the winner is Fumbling in the Dark. But of those two, I personally think Sunset Vista is worse. Slippery Climb has many tricky jumps and maneuvers that, if failed, can lead to instant death, but Sunset Vista is long enough to feel like an endurance run, and it has tricky maneuvers, lots of careful timing, pattern memorization, and those goddamn bats! Anyway, I think that about covers most of the things I wanted to talk about for this game. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and that maybe you'll even stop by to listen in again in the future. Eventually, I might even gush about Crash Bandicoot 2 or comment on whatever that thing was between 2 and Crash Team Racing.